Picture a Neolithic village, roughly 10,000 years ago, somewhere in what's now Turkey. There's a trash heap outside the settlement, scraps of food, waste, whatever a small farming community throws away. And standing at the edge of that trash heap, sniffing curiously, is a wild boar, one of the most aggressive, unpredictable, genuinely dangerous animals in the region. Here's the thing nobody tells you about how pigs actually became pigs. Nobody chased that boar down, wrestled it into a pen, and decided to breed it. The boar walked over on its own, and that single, unglamorous decision, made by the animal itself, may be the real starting point of one of the most successful domestication stories in human history. So let's actually answer the question properly. How did ancient humans create pigs, and is accident really the right word for it? Let that sink in for a second, because the honest answer flips the entire story most people assume about animal domestication. Let's start with the two competing models researchers use to explain how any wild animal becomes a domestic one. The first is what you'd probably guess. Humans capture wild animals, actively breed the ones with useful traits, and gradually shape a new domestic species through deliberate selection. Researchers call this the prey pathway, and it's a real, documented process for several species, cattle and sheep among them, where active human management was the primary driver essentially from the beginning. But there's a second model, and it's considerably stranger. Researchers call it the commensal pathway, and it describes something closer to the animal domesticating itself. Under this model, humans don't go looking for the animal at all. The animal comes looking for humans, drawn in by an easy, reliable food source that settled human life happens to produce automatically: garbage. And pigs are widely considered one of the clearest, best documented examples of exactly this second pathway in action, alongside a similarly strong case that's often made for dogs, whose own domestication is frequently explained through wolves drawn to the edges of human hunting camps for scraps, rather than humans deliberately adopting wolf pups. Pigs and dogs, in other words, may share a genuinely similar origin story, an animal quietly volunteering itself into human life long before anyone formally decided to let it in. Here's how it actually worked for pigs specifically. Once humans started settling into permanent villages and farming the land around them, roughly 10,000 years ago, those villages started generating something that simply hadn't existed before at any real scale: concentrated, predictable waste. Food scraps, spoiled grain, human sewage. To a wild boar, an animal that survives by opportunistically rooting through forest floors for anything edible, a farming village was, in a very real sense, an all-you-can-eat buffet that never closed. The boars that were bold enough and calm enough to tolerate being near humans got consistent, low-effort calories. The boars that fled at the first sign of a person got nothing extra, which means, purely through ordinary natural selection, the boars willing to stick around near human settlements had a genuine survival advantage over the ones that didn't, and that advantage had absolutely nothing to do with humans making a single deliberate choice. Anthropologist Jiajing Wang at Dartmouth College led a study published in 2025 in the journal PNAS that found something genuinely remarkable, confirming exactly this process, using a technique most people have never heard of: ancient dental calculus, the hardened plaque still clinging to fossilized pig teeth thousands of years later. Wang's team examined pig remains from the lower Yangtze region of China, dated to roughly 8,000 years ago, and analyzed the microscopic material trapped in that ancient plaque. Here's the part of this story that should genuinely surprise you. Buried inside that ancient pig plaque, researchers found eggs from a parasite called Trichuris tricura, more commonly known as whipworm, a parasite that specifically and exclusively infects the human gut. Finding human whipworm eggs preserved in an ancient pig's teeth is about as direct a piece of forensic evidence as archaeology ever produces. It means these pigs were eating human fecal waste, closely enough and often enough that a parasite specific to human digestion ended up trapped in their mouths for 8,000 years, waiting for a research team to find it. Alongside the whipworm eggs, the same dental calculus contained rice starch, yam remnants, and acorn fragments, a genuine, detailed snapshot of exactly what these early pigs were actually eating: scavenged food waste sitting right alongside genuinely wild forage. As Wang put it, some wild boars took the very first step toward domestication simply by scavenging human waste, entirely on their own initiative. There's a genuinely uncomfortable flip side to this discovery too, worth sitting with honestly. That same proximity, pigs eating human waste and humans later eating pigs, created a real, two-way channel for disease. Researchers studying this exact relationship have pointed out that the whipworm evidence isn't just proof of domestication in progress. It's also early, direct evidence of zoonotic disease exchange, parasites and pathogens crossing between species, specifically because of how closely early pigs and early humans had started living. The same intimacy that built one of humanity's most important food sources also quietly opened a new pathway for disease to move back and forth between species, a pattern that would go on to define an enormous share of human epidemiological history for thousands of years afterward. Now, it's worth being honest here, because the full picture is genuinely more layered than a single clean story. Wang's research also found evidence that some pigs at the same sites were under active human management, likely penned, fed deliberately, and increasingly controlled over successive generations, meaning the commensal and prey pathways weren't fully separate processes. They appear to have operated together, sometimes at the very same settlement, blending into each other as the relationship between people and pigs deepened over time. The self-domesticating scavenger and the deliberately managed animal weren't two different species. They were very plausibly the very same population, moving gradually from one relationship to the other across many generations. Coefficients of variation in dental measurements from these same sites actually show wild and domestic pig populations coexisting side by side for a considerable stretch of time, with genuine interbreeding happening between free-ranging wild boar and the increasingly tame animals living closer to the villages. The line between wild and domestic, in other words, wasn't a single moment. It was a long, blurry, genuinely messy transition zone that lasted for generations. And here's a detail that makes this whole story even more remarkable. Pigs weren't domesticated just once. Genetic and archaeological evidence confirms this happened independently, in at least two completely separate parts of the world, with no contact between the two populations involved. In northern Mesopotamia, in what's now Turkey, pig domestication was well underway by roughly 10,500 years ago. Entirely separately, in China, a second independent domestication process was happening by roughly 8,000 years ago, likely beginning somewhere in the Mekong River Basin or the lower Yangtze region. Mitochondrial DNA analysis has confirmed these two lineages share no direct maternal connection whatsoever. Two different human populations, on two different continents, with zero communication between them, both ended up walking through essentially the same accidental process, and both ended up, independently, with pigs. Some researchers studying the archaeological record have proposed evidence of additional, smaller, regional domestication centers too, including sites in Japan and on the island of Cyprus, suggesting this wasn't simply a two-location story, but something closer to a pattern that kept quietly repeating itself, wherever humans and wild boar happened to end up living close enough together for long enough. Over enough generations, this constant proximity to humans, and specifically the reduced need to fight, flee, or forage aggressively for survival, produced measurable physical changes in the animals themselves. Researchers studying wild boar versus domestic pig skeletons have found domestic pigs consistently show smaller heads, smaller mouths, and notably smaller teeth compared to their wild ancestors, changes researchers connect to what's sometimes called domestication syndrome, a cluster of physical traits, often resembling a juvenile or less aggressive version of the wild original, that shows up repeatedly across multiple domesticated species entirely independent of each other. Dogs, foxes bred in later controlled experiments, even some domesticated cattle. You didn't need deliberate selective breeding to produce these changes, at least not at first. Simply removing the constant evolutionary pressure to be aggressive, wary, and combat-ready was apparently enough, on its own, to start reshaping the species, shrinking the aggressive, oversized jaw and teeth of an animal that no longer needed to fight for every single meal. Recent genomic research has added one more genuinely fascinating layer to this story. Scientists studying the DNA of modern pigs have identified what researchers now call domestication islands, small, specific regions of the genome that show unusually strong evidence of selection, clustered around genes linked to behavior, coat color, and reproductive timing, essentially the genetic fingerprints left behind by this entire process. The existence of these domestication islands is now being used as a working model to study the same kind of accidental, self-driven domestication in entirely different species: cattle, sheep, chickens, and various crop plants, all potentially following some version of the same quiet, uninvited pathway pigs originally revealed. So put this together, and a genuinely fuller picture starts to take shape. Pigs weren't captured, tamed, and bred into existence through some heroic act of ancient animal husbandry. In large part, they invited themselves in. Wild boars, drawn toward the easy, reliable calories sitting in and around early human settlements, gradually became bolder, more tolerant, and more genetically distinct from their wild relatives, through nothing more sophisticated than ordinary natural selection, acting on which individual boars were willing to stick around. Humans very plausibly noticed what was happening, and eventually started actively managing and refining the process, penning animals, feeding them deliberately, selecting for useful traits. But the actual starting gun for the entire relationship appears to have been fired by the pigs themselves, wandering toward a trash heap because it was simply the easiest meal around, in at least two separate corners of the ancient world, entirely independent of each other, and possibly in several more places researchers are still working to fully confirm. Which brings us back to the actual question. How did ancient humans create pigs by accident? In a very real sense, they didn't, not entirely. They built villages. They generated waste. And an opportunistic, adaptable wild animal did the rest, showing up on its own, generation after generation, until the boar standing cautiously at the edge of a garbage heap 10,000 years ago had slowly, quietly, turned into something considerably closer to livestock, without a single human ever making the deliberate decision to start it all.